session in the entire conference. There's a prize at the end, right? And I'm told that, or was hinted, that there might be a little bit of a controversy to spice it all up. But I'll leave that up to our distinguished speakers, each of whom will speak for about 25 minutes on the respective topics. We will start with Professor Benkler of the Yale Law School, who will speak about commons-based strategies for global redistribution of information and knowledge. I think Professor Benkler needs very little introduction. Here he's been a guest at this university in the past. He's globally known for his work on the effects of laws regulating information production and exchange. Professor Benkler.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. And it's really great to see what a stable, wonderful, creative institution you've created here at Haifa, and to see now the collaboration with us here at the Interdisciplinary Center. It's a wonderful center for understanding things that are central to the way our world are, and it's a great pleasure and honor always to come and be with you. What I want to talk about today in the context of global trade-offs in the IP regime is how to think about commons-based strategies for development. And as background, I'll just say three things and assert them as facts. And obviously we can go later on in questions if people want to into justifying or not. One is that access to information embedding goods, and I'll talk a little bit about what those are, is critical to welfare. Access to information, knowledge, and information embedding tools is crucial to development and growth, as well as to welfare in any economy, and certainly in today's information-intensive economy. And largely speaking, we can imagine two types of positions about the relationships between global information regulation structure. One that would be typified by the kind of language one sees in the WSIS that was mentioned earlier today, focused on knowledge sharing, etc., but without teeth in today's international regime at all. And the other typified by the mission statement and the self-understanding of the WIPO, which is the way you achieve development and growth and innovation and distribute it around the world is have a globally strong intellectual property regime. And I won't go much into the political economy of it, but the political economy of the global trade regime has been towards the direction of tightening up intellectual property rights everywhere, moving everybody to a relatively protective regime, and thereby with the hope of creating both innovation locally and transfers elsewhere. What are information embedding goods and tools? We can think of them, I'll talk about three primary areas: food security, be it goods like improved crops like golden rice, the ideas of improved yields or improved resistance to diseases, as well as enabling technologies, higher upstream technologies that enable innovation in this particular area. So that's information embedding goods versus tools. In health, it would be drugs and vaccines versus, again, materials, existing compounds, things that are tools into the production, as well as some of the same in enabling technologies. In communications and computation, we see software and applications and hardware at one layer, standards and platforms at another. So you understand this notion of information embedding goods, things that improve welfare because of their information content in a particular way, and information embedding tools, things that embed information and enable the further production of information and the improvement of welfare through the further production of information. And we have information and knowledge for themselves rather than as embedded in tools or in goods. Scientific publications, we see the model of Elsevier, of the journal publishers and the societies, versus the Public Library of Science, ArcSIV, various free publication models. We see scientific and economic data, the model of Feist, if we could call it, just give it a name, in the US doctrinal framework of data is not itself copyrighted, as opposed to database protection, and in the EU and the pushes in the United States. News and factual reports, this is a domain of kinds of facts. We see knowledge transferred through learning by doing, actual practicing of things that are knowledge creating and knowledge embedding that are learned through the doing. And here we see various other the question of whether having drug development capabilities, whether or not they're research or generics around the world. I identify it here as CIPLA, as Indian generic manufacturers, versus thinking of the problem as having access to medicines at low prices irrespective of where produced. We see the same thing in the trade-off between the idea that free software is somehow important to development, as opposed to having Bangalore as the model with its relationships with Silicon Valley and with Redmond through the proprietary system. The other thing that we see with regard to knowledge is formal educational frameworks and the question of the extent to which educational materials are free and open. The basic question that I want to talk about a little bit is intellectual property embeds a well-known trade-off. It creates certain barriers to competition in order to allow return on investments in exchange for creating barriers to competition and therefore barriers to efficient pricing. We get incentives. The monopoly is the incentive. This is not anything new, obviously. So the question that I want to address is, how do we think about getting information, knowledge, and information embedding goods and tools without IP rights there imposing barriers on access? How do we, is there a mechanism, or what's the mechanism one could think of having the information created, having the knowledge created, having information embedded goods developed, not within the intellectual property system, but outside it in such a way that we get free access and therefore global redistribution of knowledge, information, and things that embed them. And in a play on the Chicago, the market will take care of it all, I'd like to suggest that the non-market will take care of it all, which goes roughly like this. Non-market production has always been important to information production, right? We don't have academic production of cars. We don't have academic production of wheat. We do have academic production of science. We don't have the same kind of role of nonprofits that we do in all sorts of areas of culture. While the market is important in all of these areas, or when I say the market, while property-based production is important in all sorts of areas, it is not the be-all and end-all, and there is a substantial portion of information, the information production system that operates on a non-profit, non-proprietary model. And so I'll talk about two ways of leveraging the digitally networked environment and models that we learned from the digitally networked environment to try to think of how we could set up systems of non-proprietary production alongside the market system. And remember, this comes from a certain degree of despair of the political economy of the intellectual property system, right? Most reform issues, most policy debates come from the position of saying, how do we reform law? What sort of exceptions, compulsory licenses, transfer requirements, etc., do we need to enact in order to achieve this form of redistribution? This is perhaps a point of despair, to say, we're going to fail, we're going to lose in one arena, the arena of formal lawmaking, the arena of markets dependent on formal law. Is there another way? And Neva spoke about Creative Commons as a model for rolling our own. So can we roll our own of things that are information, knowledge, cultural production, and look at two places. One tied directly into the panel that Rochelle and Neva and Hagit had earlier, talking about university research. The other talking about whether things we learned from free software and other modes of peer production can be transferable to science. So the first thing to note is that different industries are different in their structure and in their dependence on intellectual property and the extent to which one form or another or any kind of intellectual property is important. If you think of a systematic mapping of most information industries, we'll see some role for government, some role for universities, some role for individuals, some role for intellectual property-based industry, that is to say industry whose business model depends on exclusion, that depends on laws that we can understand to be intellectual property laws. Non-IP based industry, that is to say industry that makes money through services, through relationships, through all sorts of things that don't rely on intellectual property, but nonetheless appropriate the value of creating information. And NGOs and nonprofits whose main project is not like universities, the creation of information, but rather in some other mode. So if we just look at some industries, this, what I circle here, or well, circle is a misnomer, but what I outline here is all non-intellectual property dependent. And given the conversation this afternoon, putting universities in this framework is controversial, but I'll give you some numbers to suggest why it isn't or shouldn't be controversial. And the only part that is IP dependent is commercial industry that is based on intellectual property as its business model. So if we look at software, we see the NSF, National Science Foundation, and this is unfortunately very US-centric in its description of the industries, because for better or worse, my conception is one of redistribution from a very wealthy economy that finances a lot of research and development to places that require access to that research and development in order to leap over a number of decades or more of technological difference. So in the US, the NSF, the defense, DARPA, government procurement play a very important role, particularly in research and design. Free software is one very, very important phenomenon in software that occupies large portions of some markets. The really interesting piece of data here that nobody really appreciates is that only about a third of the software industry in the United States is intellectual property dependent. And about 2/3 is customization and services, things that could be done irrespective of intellectual property, because what is paid for is the person who sits and designs your own system that is not then transferable from one place to the other. These are not IP dependent, these are relationship dependent, and this covers about 2/3 of revenues of software in the United States. And again, we see nonprofits play a very important role. So software is the paradigmatic industry where, and not surprisingly, we also see the development of free software, where the relative weight of the IP-dependent industry is low, Microsoft's prominence notwithstanding when you look at aggregate numbers. And there's a lot of play for the non-market players to create a tremendous amount of value outside of the proprietary system, starting with the Internet Protocol and moving from there. With scientific publication, we see the NIH and the NSF playing an important role in funding, obviously, science. We see a tremendously important role played by Elsevier as the icon of the professional publishers and the professional associations that publish things like science. We also see, though less so in the science, in the hard, well, it depends on, changes actually from discipline to discipline, a tremendous role for individuals through working paper, web-based self-publication, conferences, papers going around. So both individuals and IP-based play a very large role. Things like Biomed Central, sort of a commercial but non-proprietary model. Things like the Public Library of Science, which is a process for creating a publication, a peer-reviewed publication system in the life sciences that is completely done by scientists and funded through government funding through author publication systems. ArcSiv, which is the main mode today of publishing in many physics disciplines, which is just post-publication peer review, not pre-publication peer review. They're relatively small, well, biomed central type models. Commercial non-IP based is relatively small. Non-profit based, depending on the discipline, is relatively large. But in the life sciences, relatively small. So main question here is there a way of moving the professional associations from selling their journals on an IP model to selling memberships and providing their journals with relatively free access? Obviously, we're talking here about a situation of getting access to the state-of-the-art for less than $10,000 a year worth of subscriptions, which most libraries in most places in the world can't pay. With regard to the relationship with the university system, the promotion and tenure system is the primary block to the efficacy of having non-proprietary publication, because most of the work is done by academics anyway. Publication today online is relatively cheap, except for peer review that is produced by the scientists themselves. What's left is the relative conservatism of the universities in accepting promotion and tenure decisions based on these models. So there's no obvious reason why scientist-based systems, perhaps with author pays for some disciplines, can't fully supplant the IP-based system. With ag, biotech, and later on pharmaceuticals, the thing that completely drops out are individuals just producing their own. Not entirely clear where the non-profit, where the non-IP based, what percentage they play. If you believe the information generated in the creation of a U.S. university consortium set up to manage the intellectual property of the various universities in the area of ag, biotech, PIPRA, if you believe the data underlying that, about 24% of patents in this area are produced by public research organizations, are owned by, 74% are owned by the IP-based industry. And the basic question is, how much can be done through university licenses to achieve redistribution from the developed to the developing world? And is there a way of leveraging individuals and NGO in this area as well using peer production? Health is fairly similar. The numbers are much harder. There's no specific place to look for the numbers of how much is invested by each one. Estimates range from 30% public, 70% private to the reverse, but let's say some substantial number. Very interesting here, the existence of the generics industry, the non-IP commercial industry as an interesting lever to work with. It's also interesting to think about the extent to which this industry provides opportunities for learning by doing as a mode of knowledge transfer from, again, the developing to the developed world. You've got things like One World Health, true non-profit pharma efforts. Again, interesting look at the landscape. And again, the questions I want to ask about is how much can be done by university licensing and how much can NGOs do? So question one. What can publicly minded university licensing, assuming that universities have something between a quarter to a half of the relevant patents in a given field, many of them upstream, so the kind of problem that was described as a problem. What can be done if we begin to focus on what's done in the GPL, Creative Commons, the various models of share alike? So the first thing we need is an internal political movement within universities, because we heard today from Chagit Mesri-Yaron that universities understand this as a necessity. They have to get money through patenting. We need to understand what the role of the university is vis-a-vis the market. We need to do some practical things, right? Tech transfer offices today measure the number of patents filed and the number of dollars arrived. They don't measure the number of lives saved. So if Yale University transfers a particular, the rights to Chagas disease uses of a particular compound to One World Health, which will do it on a non-profit basis, there's no place on the annual sheet to say, I saved X number of lives. There is a place to say, I filed X number of patents, I saved X number, I made X number of dollars, etc. Okay, so we need some practical things internally to the tech transfer system. Wow, okay. I thought we started later than that, but I'm wrong. Okay, so the thing, a few facts. It's fiscally feasible, right? We have this thing about universities need this money. Let's take a look at a few numbers. So if you look at university revenues generally throughout the United States for the last available numbers, 0.56% of university revenues come from patent licensing. If you look at the big outlier cases, Columbia and Caltech, 5% of annual revenues come from royalties. If you look at other players in the top 10, 15, so University of California, Stanford, University of Michigan, Wisconsin, Harvard, they all move between 1 and 2% a year of revenues. By comparison, public grants and contracts, that is to say publicly funded research, is on the order of between 10 and 20 times more, except again for Columbia where it's only 5 times more. So somewhere between a 5% and a 20% increase in public funding wipes out the entire IP base. And that's before you begin to account for the question of how much of these royalties come from the diversion of university research from basic research to things that are more instrumental, that could be done by the market anyway and don't need the public funding except as a subsidy later on to downstream appropriation. So the question is whether we can use the leverage of universities' indispensable ownership of some of the tools to improve access to end products and to keep free the tools of innovation. We could imagine an open research license that reserves right to follow on research as a condition of access to appropriation. The basic idea here is the North has money, create intellectual property rights and patents applicable in the North, reserve the rights to follow on research and academic research in the open research license, and reserve the rights and create a second direction subgrant for creation by generics anywhere for distribution in the developing world. So that's the basic model. If you think of it roughly like this, you have licensing. The licensing includes both open access to research, both to the university's materials and a grant back, as well as for developing nation development. So this is the idea, this is the basic idea for university patent. Major change in the politics, application of GPL type model in a trade-off and exchange. You get our research for the rich markets. We take and give back to the public both access to tools and access for production and distribution in the developing world. The second point is leveraging peer production. This is one of my favorite graphs. This is the Apache web server. It's what Amazon's secure servers runs on. It's what Google's server runs on. It's actually what the DoD, the U.S. Department of Defense website runs on. It's free software. It's owned by no one. It's made by volunteers, and it's better than the alternatives, and this has been its market structure. And for all of those who like the market, market adoption by market players should be a good argument. Design features of building such a thing, you have to modularize the task, break them down into little pieces. You have to have them, the granularity, how big or small the contributions has to match motivation, and you have to design the integration so that you can keep the process of innovation open. Much of what can be done, the problem of transferring this to science says much of what can be done with a connected computer and a human being and human creativity can be done through peer production. A lot can be done this way now. It requires rethinking of how we produce information. Software can already be done in this way. The primary questions here are to what extent this requires rolling back the digital right management and a variety of DMCA type rules in the US, and government procurement, particularly in developing nations, the extent to which developing nations will shift over to free software. With scientific publication, the primary block I see today, as I said, are universities. Wet lab sciences are much harder, and this is much more speculative, but I'll speculate in 45 seconds going at 150 miles an hour. Anything that can be modeled should be. We see this already happening to a great extent in open bioinformatics. Anything that can be modeled can be run on distributed computing. We already see folding at home, fight aids at home, real, thousands of people on the net contributing leftover PC cycles running major computations. Folding at home, probably the most productive protein folding modeling project today on the net, done through contributions of leftover computer cycles. Field data collection, this depends on the field. With farmers, actually it turns out with agriculture, it may actually be simply better to have farmers do the field data collection because so much changes with microclimate, and as you talk to agronomists, this may actually be affirmatively improving the science. Getting patients to report on their response and pushing clinical trials to the patients through web interfaces. Some people are beginning to play with this, but this is an interesting direction. Academic labs, very hard. The basic idea is grad students and fellows are the same kind of human being at the same stage of life in the same social setting as the people who write free software. So the human capacity is there. Some lab capacity has overcapacity. We saw, I think it was Hagit who talked about the old model and the new model, or the big machines and every lab having a machine. If you're in a silo system where every lab has excess capacity, very similar to what we see with computers. If you're in the big science model, much harder. But on the other hand, in the big science model, we saw human genome sequencing pushing a lot into the public domain through public and philanthropic giving. The thing to see is, as much as possible, needs to be done in ways that can harness contributions both from non-scientists and from scientists that are from excess capacity, excess human creativity in terms of the time we're willing to contribute to other things, just like in software, excess physical capacity in terms of those components of lab research that can be done with excess materials. The more the residual cost that cannot be modularized is shrunk, the more it can appropriately be attacked through public and philanthropic giving. And so it's a combination of action within civil society and action within the political sphere to get the funding that's necessary. So, to conclude, information embedding goods, tools, information, and knowledge are crucial to development and welfare. The IP system impedes the flows of these to developing nations in exchange for providing incentives for some market production in these fields. The political economy of the trade regime on IP tends to support the IP interests. Non-market strategies can provide a serious alternative solution. Doing so will require different measures in different industry R&D sectors, depending on the salience of computation and human capital relative to physical and material capital, and the relative weight of the public sector and university participation going into redesigning each of these industries. The two primary sources of non-government commons-based approaches are leveraging university research and reorganizing peer production.